My name is Jory Weintraub, and I'm at Duke University. And I want to thank everyone for tuning into the webinar today. I am joined by two of my colleagues, Megan Heitman from Iowa State University, and who just waved to you, and Janice McDonald from Rutgers University. And the three of us are part of the NABI steering committee and the leadership team and the training team for ARIS, the Advancing Research Impacts in Society Center. And I will be telling you a lot more about what those two organizations are in a few moments. I'd like to just start by thanking NORDP for setting up this webinar and allowing the NABI and ARIS community to connect with all of you in NORDP land. We're really excited to be having this conversation. We welcome questions. I'm going to be doing most of the speaking, at least initially, and Megan and Janice will be furiously trying to respond to comments and questions in the chat box. So the plan is to spend about a half hour covering these two topics. We're going to first discuss the broader impacts criterion. What is broader impacts? It'll be a very cursory overview, probably review for a lot of you, but hopefully at least some of you will learn a few new things. And then we'll spend some time talking about NABI and ARIS, the organizations, and we will leave hopefully at least 20 minutes to a half hour for questions that you have, Q&A. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the broader impacts criterion. Probably most of you are already familiar with this, but all National Science Foundation proposals are evaluated on two criteria. Those criteria are intellectual merit and broader impacts. So the intellectual merit is essentially asking, does the proposed work advance the field or advance knowledge in the field? And the broader impacts criterion basically asks, what are the benefits of the proposed work to society? So these are the two criteria that are in place. And all, as I said, all proposals to the NSF, every single one is evaluated on these two criteria. So what does broader impacts look like in practice? When we talk about broader impacts and communicating the benefits to society of the proposed research, it can take a lot of different forms. And this is one of the important things to get across about broader impacts right from the outset, is that there's a lot of leeway in what you can propose as an investigator to address the broader impacts criterion. So this slide that you see just shows some pictures, some images of some of the things that would very broadly fit the broader impacts criteria. So it could be things like, as a scientist or engineer, venturing into classrooms to talk to students about your work, or going out into public forums, doing things like at a science cafe, or speaking about your work at a science night at your children's school, for example. Broader impacts could also involve bringing students or bringing members of the public into your research setting, whether it's a laboratory or bringing them into the field with you. It could be developing new curriculum or new pedagogy to teach the discipline in which you work. A lot of broader impacts focuses on what's known as broadening participation, which means increasing diversity in STEM disciplines. It could be things like citizen science projects, so getting the public involved in helping you do your research by helping you collect data that will further your intellectual merit. That can be a broader impacts. And it can even be building or contributing to the enhancement of scientific infrastructure. So there are many, many different ways to address the broader impacts criterion. And one of the really important points that the NSF stresses is that they try not to be very prescriptive about this. There's not sort of a one-size-fits-all, and they're really looking for creativity and individuality in what they're asking for with respect to the broader impacts criterion. So many different ways to address the broader impacts criterion through many different types of projects. And in a few minutes, we'll talk a little bit more about some strategies for doing that. Just a brief mention of the history of the broader impacts criterion. The NSF was founded in 1950, and 1981, there were 4 criteria in place for addressing or reviewing all NSF proposals. And one of those was broader impacts, one was intellectual merit. In 1997, the criteria were simplified to the 2 that I mentioned previously, the 2 that are in place now. So for the last 22 years, those have been the 2 criteria by which all NSF proposals are evaluated. Since then, for the last 22 years, it's really essentially been a process of the NSF continuing to refine their and communicate their expectations of what would successfully address the broader impacts criterion. So it's been a process of essentially saying, no, folks, we really mean it. You have to take this seriously, and really focus and put in some good effort on trying to address the broader impacts criterion in a way that really effectively communicates the impact of the work to society. So why is the broader impacts criterion important? Why does it matter? Well, one way to address that is simply to say it matters because the NSF says that it matters, right? So the NSF has prioritized this, and as you saw increasingly over the last 22 years, since they simplified the criteria down to these two, they have increasingly said this is really something that we take seriously and something that we value as important, and we want our investigators to do the same thing. So we always like to point out within NABI, the National Alliance for Broader Impacts, that France Cordova, who's the current director of the NSF, you can see her in this slide, her very first public address after assuming the position of director of the NSF was at the second NABI Summit, the second time that NABI as a community met at an annual conference. And that was her first public address, and one of the things she said was that she really takes broader impact seriously, and she wants it to be an important part of her legacy as director of the NSF. So it really matters to the NSF, and it matters to everyone in NABI as well. So it's a pretty important criterion, and not simply because it makes your proposals more competitive and more fundable, but because we believe within NABI that it's really important to ask investigators to think deeply about the impacts of the work and to communicate that effectively to the public, essentially the people paying the bills for that research. It also, of course, leads to opportunities to expose children, the scientists and engineers of the future, to exciting pathways in science and engineering, and leads to greater diversity, or is intended to lead to greater diversity in STEM disciplines. So lots of really important reasons to take the broader impacts criterion seriously. So of course, we don't have time in a 15, 20-minute cursory overview of broader impacts to discuss in detail all of the things that we would normally discuss in a typical training activity or program that we would do. But we do want to mention just a couple of basic points to think about as you think about how to support, how to develop your own broader impacts activities or support researchers and investigators at your institutions who are trying to do this. So I want to talk a little bit about creating a broader impacts plan. So this is a very texty slide. I generally try to avoid all text slides, and I'm not going to read this to you, not going to expect you to read it all, but the point here is that this is directly from the NSF, and it addresses from the NSF some of the things that you should be thinking about as you're developing your broader impact section, right? And it says that among other things, your broader impacts activities have to have a well thought out rationale. You have to have a very firm plan in place for what you plan to do, what you intend to do for your broader impacts activities. Justify it with the rationale, why this is necessary. Clearly define your target audience, as well as the partners that are going to be working with you to address this broader impacts criterion. You have to have a plan in place for what resources you're going to need, what personnel you're going to need, and of course you have to have a plan in place to assess or evaluate the effectiveness of your broader impacts activities. And what I like to point out with this slide is that if this looks familiar, this is really essentially the same strategy that you're already taking when you're developing your grant ideas and addressing the intellectual merit criterion, right? So the things that you do to develop intellectual merit are the same things that you should be thinking about doing to develop a well-designed broader impacts activity or set of activities. And in fact, the NSF will state explicitly that the more you can intertwine the broader impacts and the intellectual merit components of your proposal and integrate them, the more effective that broader impacts activity or set of activities will be. So some questions that you should be asking yourself as you're developing your broader impact section are the following. And this essentially summarizes what was in the previous slide. What do you want to do for your broader impacts activities, and who's your audience? Why do you want to do it? What need is it filling? What niche is it filling? How are you going to go about doing it? What's your actual plan to implement the broader impacts activities? What are the resources you'll need? Who's going to do it? Will it be you? Will it be your graduate students and postdocs? Will you be getting undergraduates involved? Will it be a citizen science project and you'll be getting the general public involved? And who's going to help do it? And finally, again, the assessment piece. How will you know when you've done it? So these are the questions to be asking yourself as you're thinking about how to develop your broader impacts plan. And these can be summarized in the following document, which I'd like to highly recommend you all download a copy of. So this is a document that was developed by NABI several years ago. It's called Broader Impacts Guiding Principles and Questions, or the Guiding Principles document. And if you go to NABI's website, and the URL is right there at the bottom of the screen, broaderimpacts.net, you can download a copy, a PDF copy of this document for free. This was essentially developed by the NABI community to provide to panelists who are doing NSF review panels to help give them some guiding principles for how to assess and evaluate the broader impacts component of the proposals that they're reviewing. But of course, it's freely available to anyone. So I often refer to this as sort of the answer key. So anybody working on a proposal who wants to develop the broader impact section can work their way through these guiding principles and address all of these questions that are in there. And that will go a long way towards helping them put together a really solid broader impacts plan. So we're really pleased with this guiding principles document. We've gotten great feedback from it. We know that not necessarily all, but a lot of the directorates and divisions within the NSF are making this document available to their review panels to help them do a better job of assessing and evaluating the broader impacts components of the proposals they review. So check out the guiding principles document, which again can be downloaded for free at NABI's website, broaderimpacts.net. All right, so a few strategies and tips for developing broader impacts activities. And again, normally we're used to doing much longer workshops, and so we go into a lot more depth, but I just want to give you a basic overview today. And so I'm going to give you a few key points and things to think about, whether you're developing your own broader impacts activities or you're supporting faculty who are developing theirs. And the first one of these is find the right fit. So we always say that broader impacts should really reflect who you are, not just as a scientist, but as a person. So figure out what it is that your passion is, what you're about, how you spend your time, how you focus your attention and your energy, and think about how to integrate that into your broader impacts activity. For example, I'll talk with people who are writing a proposal, and they spend a lot of their time, understandably, in the lab doing research, reading papers, things like that. And I'll ask them, what do you do when you're not in the lab? And a common response will be, well, I have small kids and I spend a lot of time as a scout leader, for example, with my son's Cub Scout troop or my daughter's Girl Scout troop. And this is something I really love to do when I'm not doing my research. And so we'll suggest that you consider folding those two things together and integrating your the time you spend working with kids as a scout leader, for example, and develop some science outreach activities around the research that you're doing and share them with your scout troop. And then beyond that, you can disseminate them more widely and share them with other troops and really have a great impact with the work that you're doing. And that's a way to really tap into the passions and energies that you already have. And it's going to be a much more fun and rewarding and ultimately a more effective broader impacts activity or set of activities if you're tapping into the passions that you already have and the ways that you spend your time. So think about how you can find the right fit based on who you are as a person and how you enjoy spending your time when you're not in the lab or in the field. The next point is to find the right partner to help you do your broader impacts activities. And I should say, just as an aside, just to be clear about this image that you see, my son happened to walk into the room while I was putting this presentation together and glanced at the screen. And he said, "Dad, why do you show a picture of a person letting someone fall to their death?" And just to be clear, that is not the intention in this picture at all. It's quite the opposite. The point here is that finding the right partner, it should be someone who can help you and work with you to ensure that the broader impacts activities that you're doing are going to be successful. So in this image, he's helping his partner up, not letting his partner fall to her death, just to be clear on that one. But this is really an important step, because finding the right partner can make all the difference when you're developing and implementing broader impacts activities. In part, this is because, you know, you're not expected to reinvent the wheel every time you do broader impacts activities. So if there are people who are already doing things that are having an impact in the community, for example, rather than recreating or replicating what they're doing, consider how you can partner with them and add to the things that they're doing, add something new and novel that will be a broader impact activity for you and also advance their efforts. So for example, I always say when I'm working with faculty, you don't need to create your own summer science camp. You can find a summer science camp that's local to your community and work with them to develop some activities that reflect the work that you're doing that currently isn't represented in the summer science camp curriculum. So build on the resources that are available to you. Find the right partners. And those partners could be on your campus or at your institution, or they could be throughout your community. Local museums, science centers, zoos, aquaria, things like that are great partners. I already mentioned the idea of working with local Boy Scout or Girl Scout troops, you know, the 4-H Club, Future Farmers of America, you know, after school programs. There's lots and lots of ways to find partners in your community who can help you do a lot more and do it a lot more effectively than if you were trying to do it all on your own. So finding the right partner is a really important piece of this. The next question we often get is about evaluation and assessment. Do we have to do evaluation? And yes, I know a lot of people dread having to do this, but it is an important part of the process. In fact, the NSF has an expectation that you will not only do broader impacts activities as part of your overall research proposal, but that you have a plan in place to collect some data to tell you if you've been effective and you've actually had the impacts that you're attempting to have. So, you know, there's, again, a lot that could be said about evaluation and assessment. We don't have time to cover it in this webinar, other than to say that the NSF expects you to have an evaluation plan in place. And again, finding people who can help you with that, people on your campus, at your institution, or in your community, is often a really important point, because we understand that, you know, not everyone can be expected to be an expert on their discipline of science or engineering and on developing broader impacts activities and outreach activities around that, and on evaluating those activities. So it's perfectly fine and often advisable to find someone who can help you with the assessment and evaluation, but you do need to have that in your plan. The next thing is budgeting. It's a common question we get: should I include a budget for my broader impacts activities? And the short answer is, if it's going to cost you something to do the activities, then you absolutely need to have that reflected in your budget. So, you know, this is a big red flag if people are reviewing proposals and they see a bunch of great activities that are outlined, and these activities are obviously going to cost some money. For example, sometimes people will propose developing kits to take into classrooms and leave behind in the classroom so kids can do science. Well, that's a great idea, but kits cost money. And so if you've proposed to develop 100 kits and leave them at schools all around your community, all across your state, and you have nothing in the budget for that, that's a big red flag. And reviewers are going to say, well, how are you going to pay for that? So if it costs you something to do your broader impacts activities, that should absolutely be reflected in your budget. The next common question we get is, well, how much, right? And this is a really hard question to answer because it really varies widely depending on what your broader impacts activities are. What are the specific activities you're doing? So there's really not a one-size-fits-all answer for that. As a very, very general ballpark number, we often say about maybe 10% of your total direct costs might be a reasonable number to budget for broader impacts. But again, I don't want anyone to feel that that's, you know, written in stone, because it varies completely depending on the activities you're doing and the resources that are available to you through your institution and with your partners. So, so that it should be in your budget. If it's going to cost you something, how much really depends on what you're doing. And finally, one of the last pieces of advice I want to leave you with, and maybe one of the most important ones in terms of thinking about developing broader impacts, is do not wait till the last minute, please, right? Time is very important here. You know that when people are writing a grant over 2 days before the deadline, it's not going to be a very good grant, right? And so we always tell investigators, start writing early, start writing weeks or ideally months out, right? Well, it goes the same for developing and writing up the broader impact section. It's wonderful if you start 6 months in advance writing the intellectual merit, but if you wait until 2 days before the grant's due to develop the broader impact section, then it's not going to be a very well-developed section, and that will be reflected in the overall ranking of your proposal. So it's still the case, and it probably always will be, that no proposal will be funded unless the intellectual merit piece is absolutely rock solid. But what we're starting to see more and more is that even among those with great intellectual merit pieces, unless they have a really solid broader impacts piece as well, they're not really going to be competitive and not going to be fundable. So, don't wait until the last minute. As soon as you sit down to start thinking about your grant overall and about the intellectual merit, that's the time that you should start thinking about the broader impacts as well and developing a plan. And I always suggest that you think about developing a timeline that appears in your proposal. And that timeline not only reflects year by year what you're going to do with your intellectual merit, but right beside that, what you're going to be doing year by year for your broader impacts activities. So again, those are just a few quick comments. There's a lot more to be said about how to develop broader impacts plans, but those are some of the basic things that we like to share with investigators when we work with them and we do training workshops. And probably a lot of this is common sense and is review to a lot of you, but it's a starting point, and certainly we're happy to answer more detailed questions about that. What I'd like to do really quickly with about the 8 or 10 minutes that we have left is quickly give you a little bit more background on who we are, who's NABI, and what is the ARIS Center, and what are we all about. So I know some of you are probably familiar with NABI already, but for those of you that aren't, NABI is the National Alliance for Broader Impacts. This is an organization that was started in 2014 with an NSF RCN grant, or Research Coordination Network grant. The first NABI Summit, the first convening of NABI folks, actually happened before NABI was funded or had a name. So that occurred in 2013. And the next year was when the proposal was funded, the RCN proposal, and NABI became an official organization with support from the NSF. And NABI was started to do a bunch of different things, to create a community of BI professionals, to build individual and institutional capacity, to advance broader impacts efforts, to demonstrate the societal benefits of research, and to work between policymakers and policy implementers. And one of the things that we hear every year when we go to our annual NABI Summit, the national convening of broader impacts folks, is we hear the comment, "I've finally found my people." And what we find is that this is often the case, that there's one or two, maybe a small handful of individuals on any given campus who sort of feel like they're working in isolation in terms of doing broader impact support, and don't know a lot of other people who are doing similar work. And when they meet each other at the NABI Summit every year, it's an opportunity for them to connect with other people who are dealing with some of the same tasks and some of the same challenges. A few numbers to give you a better sense of NABI and what we've accomplished in the 6 or so years that we've been around. I mentioned the guiding principles document. At this point, we've printed over 10,000 of those, and they've been distributed literally all over the world. And that's not even counting the downloads. We don't know how many have been downloaded. NABI has currently about 760 members, representing 278 institutions. You can see the numbers, the training numbers actually have gone up since this slide was made, but we've done over 50 trainings and workshops, training over 3,300 people. And the numbers go on and on. We've had 7 summits to date. We do our summit every spring. So the most recent one was last April in Tucson, Arizona. And I'll be talking just in a minute about the upcoming one, which will be in 2020. So you can see that in a short time, NABI has really had a great impact on the community and really pulled together a lot of folks who are doing similar work and looking for a community so that we can support each other in our efforts. However, NABI was, as I said, funded originally by an RCN, a Research Coordination Network grant from the NSF. And that grant is just about to finish up. It was a 5-year grant, and it's almost done. So not quite 2 years ago, about a year and a half ago, those of us who were part of the NABI steering committee, the leadership team, got together and said, we need to figure out what comes next for NABI. So we worked on a proposal. It was an NSF proposal, a center grant proposal. We submitted that, and we are very pleased to say it was funded, and that is what has led to the creation of ARIS, the Advancing Research Impact and Society Center. The full name is Advancing Research Impact and Society Center. We just refer to it as ARIS. And this is really exciting. This grant was funded in September of last year, funded for 5 years. And you can see the number there, quite a bit higher than the RCN grant that originally started NABI. Over $5 million spread across 5 years. And one of the really important points that we always like to make about ARIS is if you look at the bottom of the slide, you can see that every single one of the directorates within the NSF has contributed to the funding and the establishment of ARIS. And that shows that the entire NSF is supportive of what we're doing and is behind our efforts and is really buying into the importance of establishing this national center. Another difference between NABI and ARIS, NABI was essentially a virtual community of people spread all across the country, in fact, all across the world, but with no physical home. But ARIS actually has a home. It is based at the University of Missouri in Columbia, where our fearless leader, Susan Reno, who many of you know, is based. She's a vice provost there and is PI of the ARIS grant. And so ARIS Center is physically based there at Missouri, but still, again, with leadership team members and co-PIs spread all across the country and members of ARIS all around the world. One other thing I want to point out about the name, you'll notice that we went from National Alliance for Broader Impacts to Advancing Research Impact and Society. So we transitioned from broader impacts to research impacts. And the reason for that is that we're trying to be really forward thinking about the role that NABI played in supporting broader impacts and how we'd like to position ARIS to do more than just broader impacts. When people hear broader impacts, for obvious reasons, they associate it with the NSF. The NSF is the only funding agency that has an explicit broader impacts criterion. But we really believe that all funding agencies, including private foundations, are increasingly prioritizing the value of communicating the impact of research across or beyond your research community and to the public. And so we were very deliberate in changing the name from broader impacts to research impacts, because ARIS really wants to position itself to support all disciplines, even beyond STEM disciplines, into humanities and the arts, helping people to do a better job of communicating the impact of the research that they're doing. So very quickly, ARIS is made up of 3 components currently: training, partnerships, and scholarship. So the partnerships is what allowed us to come together with NORDP and put together this series of webinars. The one last week that was delivered by NORDP to the NABI community, and this one that's being delivered by ARIS and NABI to the NORDP community. Scholarships, currently we have a fellowship program, and we have our first cohort of fellows. You can see them here. We should be putting out a call for new fellowship proposals in the coming months, so keep an eye out for that. And training, which is the branch of ARIS that Megan and Janice and I are involved with, and that's shown, some of the priorities are shown here in this flowchart. So we have a lot of different priorities for training within ARIS. We want to continue to do the site visits, the institutional workshops and trainings, which can be anywhere from an hour or 2 up to a half day, a full day, even multiple day workshops and trainings at your institution. So if you're interested in any of those, let us know how we can come to your campus, come to your institution and offer training and workshops. But we're also expanding that to do more webinars, more online offerings, asynchronous offerings, and beyond simply offering workshops and training, which reach an individual institution. We're going to be introducing a train the trainer model, where we will train the couple of 1 or 2 BI professionals on any given campus to do their own training within their institution so that we can amplify the total effect of the training efforts that we put forth. And finally, we're developing a project not just to work with the researchers and the BI support folks, but to work more broadly with the to provide increased institutional capacity for supporting BI on a given campus. So we'll be launching a new program this fall where institutions can apply to be part of a cohort that will work with us to help them increase and enhance institutional capacity for supporting BI on their campuses. We being the training team, has put out an assessment, a needs assessment, to get a better sense of what you, the community, would like to see in terms of training offerings. You can scan the QR code on your screen right now, and that'll take you directly to the training. I think Megan may, or Janice may also be posting a link to that. Some of the results are here. I won't take a lot of time now to go through the results, but we also have a quick poll that we wanted to put up on the screen. And so Josh, if you could pop that poll up now. Really quickly, we'd just love to ask you, those of you that are listening in, to answer these questions. You can select up to 3 things, 3 areas of broader impacts that you think would be valuable for training and enhancement on your campus or at your institution. So we'll give you a chance to vote on that, and we'll take a look and see what your priorities are. But I also want to encourage you, in addition, to go to the larger needs assessment survey and take some time to fill that out, because that's going to really help us, the training team, do a better job of serving the actual needs of the community out there. So I think that we'll leave that up. I believe we'll leave that up so that you can all have a chance to vote. And Josh, when you think that it looks like the voting is tapered off, we can post the results to that. In the meantime, I just want to mention that we are now in the process of making this transition from NABI to ARIS. I mentioned the summit that we do every year. You can see the 2019 summit was branded as a NABI summit. And next April, April 28th through 30th, we will be hosting the first ARIS Summit as we transition from NABI to ARIS, and that will be in Durham, North Carolina. And so we hope that some of you will consider attending that workshop, that summit. I wanted to mention also that there has been in the past occasionally conflicts where the NORDP conference and the NABI Summit have overlapped. And so we've heard those concerns, and moving forward as part of our partnership efforts, ARIS will be working with NORDP to avoid this kind of scheduling conflict, so that if you want, you will be able to attend both of these summits. Do we have results that we can post from the survey? So quick glance, looks like other didn't get a lot of votes. That's okay, but fairly even distribution across the various topics. As always, it looks like evaluation is a topic that everybody wants to know more about. And I can tell you, if you've been to a NABI summit before, you know that we always have at least a couple sessions on evaluation, because it is the perennial favorite topic, or topic where people really feel like they need more information and support. So I'm very confident that we will have proposals for sessions on evaluation at our ARIS Summit in Durham next year as well. Beyond that, it looks like a fairly even distribution across a bunch of different topics, which is great because it tells us as a training team that we've got a lot of work to do in a lot of different areas. And so we're definitely interested in getting this kind of feedback and doing our best to support the interests and the questions that all of you have in terms of your broader impacts capabilities. So with that, I'd like to wrap up. I just want to encourage everybody to check out the ARIS website, researchinsociety.org. Follow us on Twitter at ARIS Impacts. And I think, let's see, it is 2:35, so that leaves us about 25 minutes to take any questions that any of you have. I've seen the chat panel is exploding over here on the left side of my screen. So it looks like there's been a lot of questions already. But if there are any other questions, we'd be happy to answer them. And thank you for your time and for tuning in today.
Okay, Jory, I think the next question that I was on was, how many BIs should you have? Is only one adequate?
So when you say how many BIs, I assume what they mean is how many sort of different activities within an individual proposal.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll answer that, and Megan, you're welcome to chip in your perspective, your expertise, and Janice, if she's still available as well. But my answer would be, you know, again, that's a little bit of a difficult question to give a specific number because, you know, a single activity may not be viewed as ambitious enough. You certainly don't want to go in the opposite direction and propose too many things and be slammed for being overly ambitious. But sometimes a single activity can have multiple different components to it. One of the things that we know that the NSF really does like, though, is they don't like to see sort of just a checklist of 3 or 4 different unrelated things, right? So, for example, someone might say, well, I'll develop a new undergraduate course, and I'll go do a local science cafe, and I will create a web page talking about what I do. All of these sort of just laundry list unrelated activities. What's a much more compelling broader impacts activity or set of activities is where each of the components are feeding off each other and building off each other. So for example, if you want to develop some new curriculum to offer in local high schools, don't just develop the curriculum, but get your graduate students and your postdocs involved by putting them through workshops on effective teaching and science outreach and science communication. So you're enhancing their professional development, and then train them so that they can go into the schools and they can do some of the outreach. So it's not just you, but you're also doing professional development for your students and your postdocs. And then beyond that, maybe do workshops for the teachers as well, so that when your students and postdocs aren't there, the teachers themselves could be teaching some of this content. So if everything is connected and threaded together like that, it makes a much more compelling and comprehensive set of activities than simply a laundry list of separate items. Megan, do you want to add anything to that, or anyone else in the NABI/ARIS community who's on the call?
I was kind of answering another question at the same time. So I wasn't fully listening to your response.
Well, it was a brilliant response.
It was. From what I heard, it was. The question that I was answering, there was a question about the BI standards and activities for center grants or large team-based grants seem more involved than a single PI. And the answer to that is yes, that's absolutely true. Often with a center grant, like an STC or an ERC, there's an entire initiative or plank or whatever goal that you have that's dedicated to outreach and engagement, and also broadening participation. Oftentimes there's a co-PI listed on the grant who is fully in charge of that or fully overseeing that effort. The bar is definitely a lot higher for center grants, and the budget should also reflect that. They're usually multi-million-dollar grants or proposals, so there should be a good chunk of money that's going to any outreach efforts as well. But it's a good question. There's a lot more that a group and a team can get done, presumably, than an individual PI.
I see Peggy is asking a question. Will NSF continue to try to increase the amount of feedback researchers get from reviewers on the broader impacts component of their proposal? I think the answer is yes. I know that's something that's come up a lot in our discussions with NSF folks, with the directors and the people who run the review sections. You know, I think that one of the challenges is that a lot of the people, when you submit a proposal to the NSF, it's going through peer review, which means that the people who are reviewing your proposal are, you know, similar to the people submitting the proposals. They're scientists and engineers who themselves may not have a lot of experience with science outreach. That's exactly why we developed the guiding principles document, to help them with that. But I think increasingly the NSF is hearing the requests from people submitting proposals saying, you know, if we want to do a better job with the broader impacts component of our proposal, we really need structured feedback. And so I think that's something they're going to put more effort into in the future. I also know there's been a lot of discussion over the last few years about, you know, would it be possible to have sort of a dedicated outreach or public engagement or broader impacts expert be a member of every review panel? And I think it's an interesting idea. And, you know, I don't know where that stands. It probably, like most things in the NSF, varies from directorate to directorate and division to division. But I think they've heard those requests as well. And so we might see some development in that area, which would be wonderful from my perspective.
Jory, can you go ahead and answer the next question of a lot of the BI examples are focused on education, particularly for youth. Is that more highly valued than other types of community outreach?
Yeah, so that's a very common question we get as well. And again, I think the NSF has deliberately tried to be less prescriptive about what they're asking for. And so I think, they say that's a great thing to do, and it's a great broader impact example. It's certainly not the only one. It's true that a lot of things focus on engaging, K through 12 students and youth in STEM disciplines, for example. But another area that's probably, equally popular, if not more, would be the broadening participation piece, the diversity and, trying to make STEM more diverse and inclusive. And so, I think that really the answer should not be so much trying to predict what reviewers are looking for as the most popular target type of activity, but rather go back to what I said earlier about finding the right fit for you. An example, if anyone out there has ever been through one of my workshops or Megan's workshops or Janice's, you've heard us say, that the classic example is someone comes in and says, I know my broader impacts is supposed to be me going into schools and talking to students about what I do, but I don't really feel comfortable talking to kids, or I don't like kids, or I don't like school, or, something like that. So what do I do? And, our answer would be, well, if you don't like kids, you shouldn't do your broader impacts involving conversations with kids, right? You should build on what your passion is and what your interests are. And so if you're not comfortable going to schools, if that doesn't fit with your comfort level and your expertise, then certainly find other ways to address that criterion that are a better fit for the things that you enjoy doing and the things where you have strengths. Megan or anyone else from NABI, do you have anything to add to that?
That sounded good to me. And see, the next question I see on here, I'm trying to go in order, but they're all coming in quick, is does anybody have a list of dedicated BI offices at universities nationally and presumably their impact? ARIS has a list of members and institutions that we represent. A dedicated office is something that's sometimes harder to quantify, only because there are so many different forms. Some of our partners or offices are within colleges, some are university-wide, some are within education outreach centers, some are just one person in a larger research development office. But we do have a list that will hopefully soon be searchable on our ARIS website. But if you had a specific area in mind, or if you had a specific institution and you wanted to know, you could send us an email and we could look that up and get back to you while we transition.
Yeah, I'll just add that, we used to keep track of how many dedicated BI offices there were. That was offices with broader impacts in the name somewhere. And, the standard comment was there were, across the nation, there were fewer than 10. But we really started to realize that number was sort of meaningless, because while there may have only been 7 or 8 offices that had broader impacts in the title of the office, there were certainly many more institutions, as Megan said, where it may not have been a BI office by name, but it was an office of community engagement or something in the research development office, or the extension office, where they were essentially doing BI support and BI work. So really, I think it's less about what the center is called and more about what their mission is and what they're doing. But having said that, as Megan said, we do try to keep track of people, and that's a big advantage of NABI being a very robust community, is that, and transitioning to ARIS, is that it allows us to try to keep a connection among all the people around the country that are doing this type of work.
Okay, the next question is, do you have to have BI activity partners confirmed at the time of the proposal submission? From Diana Potter. And I would say that it is very helpful to have someone, a partner, figured out and at least lined up beforehand that could write a letter of commitment. to attach to the proposal if you have a broader impact partner. If you don't at the time, then give a couple examples of something that is more specific on campus and just state that you might not have contacted them yet, or you're in the works of trying to, but don't commit services in a partnership with somebody you haven't talked to yet. We see that sometimes, and then they come into the partner and the partner has no idea who this person is and doesn't know how to help them. So I would say if it's feasible to have a letter of commitment and a partner at the time of submission, that it probably carries a little bit more weight to it, and would be a good idea to already have at least that contact there.
I noticed Nathan made a comment or a reference to an example of doing prison outreach as a broader impacts activity. This is the one that I always cite as my favorite example of an absolutely brilliant broader impacts activity. It's work done by Nalini Nadkarni, who's been a longtime member of the NABI/ARIS community, and she's at the University of Utah now. And her work, she's published on it, and she has websites about it. Maybe I'll just type in her name here, and if you Google her, Nalini Nadkarni is her name, and if you Google her, then you can find her work about her sustainability in prisons project and all of the other great work she's doing. She currently has a project called the STEM Ambassador Program that's sort of taking the prison work and extending it to other areas where people are underserved and get a sort of a lack of exposure to STEM beyond simply prisons. So check out Nalini's fantastic work, both with the work in prisons, but also with the STEM Ambassador Program extending beyond prisons.
Okay, the next question that's listed is from Kate Coleman. How would you advise us on quantity versus quality of the broader impacts plan, reaching a large amount of people versus a thoughtful impact on a small number of members in the community?
Yeah, another great question. And again, I invite my NABI colleagues to chip in on this as well. But I get that question a lot. And again, not to sound like a broken record, but I think a lot of it has to do with what activities are going to fit your interest best. I think you can make a really compelling case for either doing something that is an inch deep and a mile wide, or something that's a mile deep and an inch wide, right? So it really depends on where you want to have the impact. I think it's less about which one of those you choose and more about doing a really good job in your proposal of justifying why you're choosing that particular approach, right? So if you can give a really sound rationale for why you're choosing to do the particular thing you're doing, then that's going to make it a more compelling proposal. And part of that rationale should include why you particularly are well suited to take that type of approach. So that would be my answer. Megan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, that's exactly what I would say. As long as you're having an impact that you can measure in some sense, I'm not sure that it really matters if it's a large audience with less information or a smaller audience that really is doing some in-depth training. I think as long as it makes sense with your proposal and that you can track it and show that there's an impact there, I think that's mainly what the NSF is looking for. Okay, here's a question for you, Jory, since this is one of our examples. Are my BIs limited to the US as this is an NSF grant, or can I reach into the other countries, especially if relevant to my project in general?
I think that the NSF really wants to have an impact within the US, but if you can also have an impact on people beyond the US, that's okay. I'm probably not an expert on this particular question, but my sense is that if your broader impacts is only affecting people beyond US borders and not within, that would be looked upon very negatively. But if it is reasonable to try to do both, then I think that could potentially really strengthen your proposal. What do you think, Megan? How would you answer that one?
Yeah, and we've had this as an example in a number of our workshops, and some faculty have come up with really good ideas on keeping things in the United States. Like if you're going to do field studies somewhere internationally, and you can take like a webcam or have like a FaceTime meeting with a group of kids, some sort of organized classroom of kids, and show them your research in the field or bring things back for them to do experiments on, those types of things might also be effective. And then it's training, the next generation in STEM in the United States. Or also if there's any experiments overseas that you need to or would like to have some sort of baseline in the US or compare it to US, and you can have a group of citizen science help you collect that data for something local in the United States, then that's also a way to bring that international research into something more local. I think those are a couple ideas that have come up that really resonated with me at various workshops.
Yeah, and I would just add, based on the fact that my background is actually as a biologist, not as a research administrator, there's a sort of a long history of researchers, not just biologists, but researchers in general, who are doing research in other countries, often in underdeveloped or developing countries. There's a perception that often it's a very one-sided sort of event where a researcher will go into a country, collect data, collect samples, collect specimens, take them back to the US and do research on them without really giving back to the community very much. This is something that I think researchers in general should be sensitive to. And so I think if there's a way that your broader impacts can do things to give back to the local community through education or through, learning resources or something like that, in addition to serving as a site for collecting data, I think that's really a wonderful outcome of doing field research.
Okay, the next question that I came across is about Summit 2020, bringing a small group of faculty if possible. The question is, would I engage career-minded faculty on the education research component to understand BI, or those successful with NSF support and wanting to expand their basic research to NIH or other sponsors to learn about the research impact in society? I would say either of those researchers would benefit from coming and seeing examples and seeing some of the ways that you can work with research in society. We have found that a lot of more junior faculty, postdocs, and graduate students get a lot out of specifically our BI 101 workshops and our BI identity workshops, and trying to figure out what they're passionate about and what sort of broader impacts activities they can do and set up. But at the same time, experienced faculty who have maybe done more in-depth broader impacts in their past also come and learn a lot of new stuff of things that they just hadn't thought about. So I would say that's up to you on who you want to bring. We do usually have discounts for groups coming from the one institution, something like there's a price break at 5, like if you bring 4, you get the 5th for half price or something like that. So let us know if you plan on bringing a group from your institution, and we can get you the promo code for that. It's a very diverse group that comes to the summit. There's anyone from grad students to, vice presidents of research, nonprofits, museums, libraries type area, administrative research administrators, all sorts of different people.
I may be a little biased because I live there, but Durham's also a really fun town. So I think you'll have a good time if you come visit us next April. And that's usually before it gets too oppressively hot and humid here. I also noticed that we're almost out of time. It's about 2 minutes to 3, according to my clock. So before people start tuning out, I just want to make sure I say one more time, thank you so much to Peggy Sundermeyer and Nathan Meyer and all of NORDP for setting up this sort of partnership, this webinar swap, and giving us the opportunity this week to tell people in the NORDP community more about broader impacts and about NABI and ARIS, and also for doing a great webinar last week to the NABI and ARIS community about research development and NORDP. And so we really appreciate the opportunity to work with them and to build this partnership between our organizations. What do you think, Megan? Any time for any more questions? Or I think maybe all of this will be archived and it's being recorded so that we can so that you can play it back later if you didn't get enough the first go around.
Yeah, there were many questions or comments on examples of BI or specific kind of consulting ideas. Real quick, ARIS, we don't have specific examples of BI statements that we will give out because that, we're a national center and it's still a national competition. So we don't have specific BI sections that are written up to use as templates. We also don't do specific consulting on individual projects for the same reason, but we do compile kind of a list of things that have different faculty members or different researchers have done well, like Nalini's work. And there's a lot others that we know about and that we'll try to highlight in our upcoming newsletters. If you follow us on Twitter, there's a lot of good articles about our fellows, our faculty fellows that we have right now. And we'll also highlight some other stories of good BI work. And there's a broad list. It's not just all K-12. It's not just education and outreach. There's a broader audiences and broader work that counts as broader impacts activities. So we don't have specific BI sections or templates because we're not really allowed to, and we don't do individual consulting, but we can also, if you send us like a request on who might be somebody in your area or at your institution to connect with, we can definitely get that information to you. And then they can be more specific with specific local resources, and they can help you hopefully in the writing and the template type things.
Yeah, I would just add, if you want to look at some specific examples, Georgia Tech University has their sponsored research or I can't remember if it's research development. I think it's their sponsored research office. On their website, they have a list of examples of BI sections from proposals that have been funded by the NSF coming from Georgia Tech. So any Georgia Tech proposal to the NSF that gets funded, they have an excerpt, which is basically the one paragraph summary of the BI project, as well as the dollar amount that the total grant was funded for. So that's a great way to just sort of scroll through and get a sense of what some of the funded projects out there by NSF have been doing as far as broader impacts activities go. So I would definitely recommend checking that out as well. Again, I want to thank you all for tuning in and for asking a lot of great questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to answer all of them, but hopefully you got some useful information. And thanks again to Nathan and Peggy and Josh and everyone at NORDP who made this possible. And please be in touch, and we hope to see a lot of you in Durham at the ARIS Summit next April, 28th through 30th. Thanks, everybody.